Hello student, welcome to lecture 4.4, the Civil Rights Movement of the 1950s and 1960s. In this lecture, we will focus on the fight against racial segregation, racial inequality, and disfranchisement of African Americans during the 1950s and 1960s. So we will start with a major victory over racial segregation in public schools under the Brown versus the Board of Education case. And we will specifically talk about the role of the NAACP in this case and other cases, and how the white people in the South resisted the implementation of the Brown, which means how they resisted desegregation of schools and other public facilities. Next, we will continue with the lynching of Emmett Till. After that, the most important part of this lecture will be the review of the strategies used by the civil rights leaders during the civil rights movement. So the strategies include boycott, sittings, freedom rides, and marches. And then after that we will summarize the prominent leaders and organizations of the civil rights movement, and finally we will also summarize the major victories of the civil rights movement. So what was this celebrated Brown versus the Board of Education case all about? The Brown versus the Board of Education, which is simply known as the Brown for many people, was a case brought by the parents of Linda Brown against the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. And it was about the segregation of this little girl from a school nearby her house. The case reached the Supreme Court in 1954 and was consolidated, which means combined with other cases of school segregation from other states, including the state of South Carolina and Virginia. The decision of the Supreme Court in this case, in summary, was that segregation in school was unconstitutional. So that's a summary of a decision of the Supreme Court. In other words, this case ended segregation not only in public schools but also in any public facility at that time. So what was the role of the NAACP in the Brown case? Starting in 1940, the NAACP established a Legal Defense and Educational Fund, LDEF, to fight segregation and discrimination in education, housing, unemployment, and politics. So in 1944, the NAACP already won its first victory in the case of Smith versus Allwright. And this is a case about white primary in Texas. So the U.S. Supreme Court declared that primary reserved to white voters was unconstitutional. So they have to include black people in the primaries. And then 10 years after that, in 1954, the NAACP helped Linda Brown's parents and other parents to bring the case of segregation in public school and won this major victory in the Brown case. So we can see in this picture Linda Brown, whose name is now associated with the Brown case, the Brown versus the Board of Education, and which led to the end of segregation in public schools and other public facilities. Concerning the resistance of white people to the Brown case, most white people did not comply right away with the Supreme Court decision in the Brown case. And the most famous example happened in Arkansas, in the Central High School of Little Rock, and this is known as the Little Rock Nine, in 1957. And among the most famous politicians, white politicians who refused to comply with Brown, we can mention the senator of South Carolina, Senator Strom Thurmond, who dominated the politics in the state for many years, and the most famous among the people who refused to comply with desegregation was the governor of Alabama, George Wallace, who in 1963, almost 10 years after Brown, would still declare segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. So that was his determination to stop desegregation. In addition to racial segregation, discrimination, and disfranchisement, black people, especially in the South, continue to endure random acts of violence from some white racist people. And one of the most famous cases that attracted the attention of the whole nation was the lynching of Emmett Till in 1957. Emmett Till was a teenager from Chicago, and he went down south to visit relatives in Money, Mississippi. But he was lynched by two white men who alleged that he was courting a white lady at the store. So that was a violation of racial etiquette, according to white Southerners. So he was lynched and murdered by these two men. The two men were actually arrested, but they were both acquitted despite the evidence that linked them to the murder. Nevertheless, Till's mother made sure that the whole country knew about the crime. So she opened the casket of her son so that everyone saw the picture of her son in the casket. And that led to a national outrage about act of violence against black people in the South. Before reviewing the strategies used by the civil rights leaders to fight racial segregation, discrimination, and disfranchisement, let's define what the civil rights movement was all about. So the definition that we have of this term civil rights is that it was the long decades struggle by African Americans to end legalized racial discrimination, disfranchisement, and racial segregation in the United States. And according to historians, it really started in 1955 and ended in 1968. So this is why the Brown case was not always included among the civil rights movement. In addition to the battle in court that was waged by the NAACP since its creation, the strategies used by the civil rights movement leaders included boycott. So the most specific example was the bus boycott in Alabama. There were also sit-ins, especially the lunch counter sittings, And the most well-known strategies were the marches, but you have also freedom rides. So this consists in riding buses from the north to the south. So the most famous case of boycott, like I said earlier, was the Montgomery bus boycott. This bus boycott was decided against the city bus of Montgomery, Alabama, and it started in 1955 after Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her seat to a white man. And the boycott of a bus by African Americans continued until the company decided to desegregate the seating in the bus. So this happened 2 years after that, in 1957. And this boycott made Martin Luther King Jr. One of the most famous leaders of the civil rights movement. He was asked to lead this boycott, and he did it well, and that's why he also was asked to do other things. So we can see on this picture Rosa Parks on a Montgomery bus on December 21st, 1956. So this is after the city bus was desegregated. The other effective strategy against racial segregation was the sitting, and especially the lunch counter sittings. So the lunch counter sittings were started by 4 students in North Carolina at the College of North Carolina Agricultural and Technical College in Greensboro. And the lunch counter sittings consist just in sitting at the counter of a segregated restaurant until one is served by the waiters. So supported by the NAACP, other lunch counters were organized in different cities in the South. For instance, in Nashville and in Atlanta. Another effective strategy against racial segregation and disfranchisement was the freedom rides by students from the North, mostly white students. And the most well-known among these rides were those of 1961. So the ride of 1961, the freedom rides of 1961, were organized by James Farmer and Bayard Rustin of the Congress of Racial Equality, the CORE. So this is a famous civil rights organization from Chicago. And the rides consisted in getting northern white students to ride buses to the southern states. And in this case, they would help black people in the South to desegregate terminal buses in the South. But many riders were brutalized by white people in the South, and that also shows the brutality of the resistance of the white people in the South. In the summer of 1963, CORE and SNCC, these are 2 famous student organizations, organized voting registration drives focusing on Mississippi. And Mississippi at that time was considered the toughest nut to crack, which means the toughest state that practiced segregation, and that was difficult to crack. So students mostly white students from the North rode buses and went to the state of Mississippi to help black people to register to vote. But 3 of these students were murdered, and these students were Andrew Goodman, James Earl Cheney, and Michael Henry Scherner. You may have heard of the names of these students, and they were part of this Mississippi Freedom Summer of 1963. But the main strategy against segregation, discrimination, and disfranchisement were the marches. And you have many of these marches, but the most famous among them was the March on Washington in August of 1963. This march was organized by Martin Luther King Jr. With his group, and it attracted up to 250,000 marchers of different races. So you have blacks and whites and Asians and Latino, so everyone participated in this march in Washington. And it was at that time that Martin Luther King Jr. Delivered his speech, "I Have a Dream," which is still famous up to this day. So we can see on this picture Martin Luther King Jr. during the March on Washington in 1963. You can imagine how many people were in this place at that time. Another famous march was the march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama in 1965, and this march was also organized by Martin Luther King Jr. and his association, the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Council in 1965, and national and international television stations came to this march and captured the brutality of the police. They used different means to stop the march, but the marcher managed to complete this march. And there's also a movie on this event if you are interested. So now, who were the most prominent leaders and organizations of the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s? The most prominent leader was obviously Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. was the son of a pastor, of Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. He attended the College of Morehouse in Atlanta before attending Boston University, where he earned his PhD in theology. And then, after that, he moved to Alabama, to Montgomery, Alabama, to lead the church there. And as he was in Alabama, he started to create different organizations and led different movements against the racial segregation. So one of the organizations that he created was the Southern Christian Leadership Council, the SCLC, and we already talked about the march, the most famous march that he organized in 1963. So we already talked about the leaders, so let's talk about the organizations. So we already mentioned earlier the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Council, but another organization that is worth mentioning was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. SNCC or SNCC. So this organization was created by students, black students from 13 states who met in 1960 at Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina. And the founder, the leaders of the organization at that time was Ella Baker. So she used to be a member of the SCLC, but she was dissatisfied with this organization, and that was the reason why she created with other people the new organization, the SNCC, that focused really on Black power and also protest against the Vietnam draft. Now let's review some of the major victories of the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s. There were many civil rights acts passed by Congress since the Reconstruction in the 1860s, but the most important civil rights act was passed in the 1950s and 60s. So we have the Civil Rights Act of 1957, which created a commission to monitor a violation of civil rights, and also proposed remedies for voting problems. So that's a major Civil Rights Act of 1967. In 1964, another Civil Rights Act was passed by Congress, and this one established new powers for the U.S. Attorney General. It also banned discrimination in public accommodations such as school, restaurants, and so on and so forth, as well as in public schools, parks, playgrounds. And it also banned discrimination in employment. Finally, concerning the disfranchisement of African Americans, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and this followed the march from Selma to Alabama. So this Voting Rights Act ended the systematic exclusion of African Americans from Southern politics. So that includes voting registration and also the right to run in public office. And the Voting Rights Act of 1965 also gave power to the U.S. Attorney General to intervene. So that concludes lecture 4.4 and module 4. So please complete all assignments included in this module, and the two major written assignments for this course, which are the biography of an African American figure, as well as the analysis of the primary source. And then you may take the final exam.